Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 47 after episode 5, the end of the pre-merge. And this was a pretty good episode, all things considered. And while the boot by the end of it was kind of obvious, I feel like there's still plenty of interesting stuff to break down here for what will happen in the future, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 14 people to talk about, and as we waste more time, let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 14, we have the latest boot from the season, and here we have Anuka. And I feel like this was largely to be expected here, as Anuka was someone I was pretty low on. I feel like there's a lot of potential for her to be an early boot, considering the edit that she's gotten. And I feel like at the point where Gata was going to tribal, and the fact that she got a confessional immediately after the immunity challenge, talked about how it was a surefire thing that anyone would go home. It just made all the sense in the world for Anuka to be the boot instead. And even from an in-game standpoint, it also made the most sense for Anuka to be the boot, considering that she couldn't vote, meaning that Sierra didn't have much incentive to side with the bribe winners group, not to mention that voting out Andy would have strengthened the amulets for the other tribes. So again, Anuka going here made a lot of sense here. And if we're talking about Anuka overall, while I was never high on her in the preseason or during the actual season, I don't think she played that poorly at the end of the day, where she had a very solid alliance with Rachel, also built a good bond with Sierra and Sam. And I think she kind of gets screwed over by the circumstances surrounding her vote out, where she couldn't vote as a result of the journey, where she was forced to draw a bag, sort of similar to what we saw from Sarah from 44. And also the amulets also giving a further incentive to take her out over Andy. So I do think she gets pretty unlucky by how things shook out by the time they went to tribal, even though she had this solid alliance behind her at the end of the day. Not to mention that she took her vote out very hard, and I do feel bad for her in that regard, considering how emotional she got there, but that's Survivor for you. But obviously Anika's now out of the game, which is why she's here number 14. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them. That way you can potentially be the next challenge beast on Survivor 47 and beyond. In this season, we have creator lockers. These are special bundles handpicked by myself and other Survivor YouTubers, along with creator trading cards. If you purchase my puzzle, you can get your hands on the Labyrinth Ball puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If you want to take home these puzzles and more, feel free to use my link in the description or use my affiliate code, Survivor Gumball, and start prepping now. And with that, we have 13 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off their edit and current game position. But number 13, the person I believe is the least likely to win the game coming into Mergatory is Saul. And Saul is someone I'm still pretty low on. I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for him in my eyes, where his only confessional comes while Rome is dishing out all this information to him about how Tini has an amulet, and they weren't sure if they could work with Tini. And despite this coming from Rome of all people, Saul is still shocked to learn all of this, how despite him having over 20 years of sales experience, that he's been served humble pie here. And again, just a strange confessional for him to be getting, despite the fact that it came from Rome, someone he's shown to not trust that much. So again, I feel like Saul's still someone who isn't really getting much favors on this show, and while he got a little bit of personal content in this episode, I feel like it wasn't really enough to make him a contender for me, which is why he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another person who I am pretty convinced is not winning at this point, but we do have Rachel. Now, truth be told, I feel like out of all the people here, I think Rachel is very likely to be the next boot, where considering the content that she's gotten up to this point of having a sizable edit, but not really having much substance behind it, makes me feel like she's pretty primed to be taken out in this spot. Sort of similar to Mariah from last season, or even a Sydney from 41. We even got that in this episode, where her one confessional comes after the reward challenge, talking about how her and Sam got to go on the social hour and that this information will be good for their games. And while we do see her getting roped into this group with Tini and Caroline, I just feel like Rachel herself is not really being set up to do well there. I feel like more of the content was focused on Caroline, and even Tini is shown to be more relevant in the story compared to Rachel. Not to mention the fact that she's on the outs during this vote, where she gets blindsided, loses her closest ally in Anuka, and we even see Andy getting a lot of credit for tricking Rachel and defeating him this fake plan that will be used to help him get the majority there. So again, I'm not feeling the greatest about Rachel, where she doesn't really get much to do in this episode outside of just talking about the reward. And I feel like considering the other content she's gotten up to this point, it wouldn't shock me if she's booted next round, or if not, within the next couple of weeks. I just feel like there's not really much longevity for Rachel at this point, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and this was someone who I had my eyes on coming into this episode, but I feel like this episode didn't really do them much favors. But number 11, we do have Genevie. And I feel like this was a really rough episode for Genevie here, where it does start off all right with her explaining the Keyshawn vote, talking about how this was her move and that Keyshawn's a threat that you don't see until it's too late. But then later on, we see her kind of playing sloppily here, where we have her talking about how Rome's chaotic and that him running around after the reward challenge is like them losing an immunity challenge. We see her kind of throwing Rome under the bus here, where she finds out that Rome was the one to say that Genevie didn't want to work with Saul. And again, a lot of not great stuff here. More said to her eventually turning on Rome here. And admittedly, I feel like a lot of it's circumstantial in my eyes. I feel like a lot of it's going to play out in the next couple of episodes with the merge about to happen and Rome potentially being a bigger target at the end of the day. And I am starting to come back around to the idea that she could potentially just be taken out because of Rome here, where I feel like this was a mostly bad look for her gameplay wise, with her like having a sloppy conversation with Saul after Saul finds out that she said that she didn't want to work with him. We have her saying confessional that she doesn't actually trust Saul that much, but she doesn't want him to know that, which is kind of going against what she said last episode about seeing Saul as a person. So I'm just not getting the greatest sense from Genevie in the world, and I feel like this episode didn't really do her any favors, which is why she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I still don't think is winning at this point, but number 10 we do have Gabe. Now, truth be told, I think Gabe will have some longevity within him. I feel like he's definitely primed to get to around the final 7, sort of similar to Danny from 44. But at the same time, he's definitely not winning at this point, where first up you have him getting this confessional about how beneficial the social hour would be, and that it'll be huge strategically since they're super close to the merge and that meeting new people will be powerful, only for him to be the only person from Tuku to not win the reward and is left at camp by himself. But even then, he doesn't get any scenes at camp by himself. I feel like that could have been a great opportunity for him to have personal content there, but instead they kind of just brushed him aside while we see the other two tribes showing the people that lost the reward there. So I feel like the fact that Gabe didn't get this personal content, talking about how he missed this opportunity to meet other people while the likes of Caroline gets to make these new connections, is not a great sign for Gabe here. Not to mention that we get more villainous content from him after the fact, talking about how Tiana was throwing him under the bus, and he goes on this really over-the-top confessional about how he is going to be smiling when he sees Tiana's torch get snubbed, which, again, a lot of this is pretty over the top here and definitely leading to a downfall at some point. And I feel like Gabe is definitely not winning at this point, which is why he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who is definitely not winning at this point, but we do have Rome. And this was an interesting episode for Rome here, where, again, a lot of it's more the same with him being this pretty big character, a pretty big person to dunk on. And we definitely see that with him, where he's definitely cooking a bit too much back at camp after losing the reward challenge. We have him kind of degrading Tini by talking about how he doesn't trust them and that Tini's definitely at the bottom and that he doesn't care that they're remorseful, that the trust there is broken. We also have Genevie talking more about how she wants to turn on him at some point after she finds out that he told Saul that Genevieve can't be trusted. And again, a lot of this is not great. I feel like Rome is definitely not being set up to do well moving forward. And while I think there could be some longevity there, where he'll continue to be this big character, I feel like it's definitely not leading to a win at this point, which is why he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I have been going to bat for a couple weeks, but after seeing this episode, I'm just not feeling it at this point. But number 8, we do have Kyle. And Kyle got another pretty underwhelming episode, if you ask me, where his only confessional comes after winning the reward and him just describing the reward and all the great stuff there and him being able to have veggie dogs because he's a vegetarian. So there's that. And while he also gets to talk about how this is a good chance to build bonds and to find cracks, he's not really shown having any game talks himself and even gets undermined where we see him playing cornhole while Caroline's building this alliance with Tini and Rachel, and Caroline gets his confessional about how while others are playing cornhole, she's playing Survivor. So I think that kind of makes Kyle look pretty bad at the end of the day. Not feeling the greatest about Kyle at this point. And while there is a world where he could turn around after the merge, I feel like considering this is now the 3rd episode in a row where he hasn't gotten that great of an episode, I can't really justify putting Kyle too much higher at this point. And while he could turn around, possibly, I feel like I can't have him any higher than number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this is someone who definitely had a better episode compared to last week, but a lot of it still felt pretty circumstantial. But number 7, we do have Caroline. And Caroline's episode here was pretty interesting for the most part, where she gets a decent amount of focus on the reward, where we see her building this alliance with Tini and Rachel, talking about how, while others are playing cornhole, she's playing Survivor. And the fact that Caroline's getting this content of creating this alliance is pretty good, considering that you have the likes of Tini, who has been getting a decent amount of content themselves. The fact that it's Caroline that is getting this content is all pretty good. However, I think she also gets conflicting content afterwards, where we see her talking about being the mother hen and wanting the Tuku tribe to be united so that she has more options. And this leads to her telling Tiana that she should come clean to Gabe about throwing Gabe under the bus during the reward. And then we see Tiana doing that and just creating more division within the Tuku tribe, where now Gabe is even more against Tiana, and Tiana is more incensed about targeting Gabe moving forward. So I'm conflicted over whether that's good content for Caroline at the end of the day, considering she didn't really get what she wanted and that her own objective was counterproductive. So again, I think it's kind of a mixed bag for Caroline here, and while I think she'll probably have some longevity moving forward, I'm still very conflicted about where her story is truly going, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I'm still also kind of conflicted by. By number 6, we do have Tiana, and obviously Tiana gets a decent amount of flack in this episode for her throwing Gabe under the bus during the reward challenge, and then afterwards we see Caroline approaching Tiana about coming clean to Gabe, and we see Tiana telling this half-truth to Gabe about how she did tell people that he was idol hunting, but that she only told 2 people, only for that to be corrected later when it turns out she talked to everyone in the reward. And again, it's not a great look, and we even see Gabe continuing to target Tiana by saying that he'll be happy to see her torch snuffed, which admittedly I think is just set up for Gabe's downfall here, where I feel like Tiana will ultimately defeat Gabe, which I think is a major reason why she is as high as she is. Where despite her like having this blunder and her getting into trouble by Gabe, the fact that the merge is about to happen means that'll probably not result in any immediate blowback here. And I feel like with Gabe being pretty set up for a downfall, I think Tiana could definitely use that to propel her storyline in the future. But I still feel like I'm higher on other people at this point, and I feel like with Tiana getting mostly circumstantial content before this episode, I can't really have her above number 6 at this current point. Now moving on to number 5, and we have another person who I continue to have relatively high, even though I'm still not entirely sure where their story is going. But number 5, we do have Sue, and I think the major thing about Sue is she's clearly being set up for the storyline of eventually realizing that Gabe is not to be trusted, where we once again see in this episode that she talks about how Gabe's her number 1 ally and that Gabe is someone that should be protected even when Tiana's throwing him under the bus. All at the same time, Gabe is someone who is underestimating Sue and continually trashing her and seeing her as a goat. And to me, a lot of this is clearly set up to Sue eventually realizing that Gabe is someone that she needs to take out in order to truly assert her badass nature or whatever. So I think that's a major reason why I continue to have Sue this high, even though she's shown propelling Gabe and talking about how Gabe is to be trusted, even though he's been anything but across the season. So I think the fact that she at least has this storyline is a major reason why she still remains a contender for me. However, at the same time, I also question how much of this is a journey edit, where perhaps she may wait too long to turn on Gabe to where she starts to come off as Gabe's puppet. Alternatively, she could eventually grow to realize that Gabe's a threat, become a big player in herself, but also become a big threat in the process after people realize that she is a big force. So I feel like that's a major reason why she isn't higher for me, where I feel like other people are clearly being set up more to actually win the game. But I feel like the fact that Sue at least has the storyline of eventually turning on Gabe is a big reason why she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is someone who I had jumped up quite a bit from last week, but after seeing them this episode, I did decide to bump them down just a bit. But number 4, we do have Sierra, and this was a strange episode for Sierra here, where we see her working again with Sam, but also mentioning the breadwinners, and we see her being put to the test, where she has to choose a side here after they go to tribal. And we see her voting out Anuka, which from a game perspective makes a lot of sense, considering that Anuka couldn't vote, so even if she sided with Rachel, she would have only been forcing a tie. Not to mention that voting out Andy would have strengthened the amulet, while not really giving her any connection to the people that are responsible for the amulet. So again, the fact that she votes out Andy here makes quite a bit of sense, and I felt like it was coming for a lot of the episode. However, I also question how it's actually framed in the episode, where despite it being the correct decision for her within the game, I feel like the episode kind of shows it as Sierra not getting her way here, where the episode makes it abundantly clear that Sam wants Andy to stay, how Andy staying in the game is better for Sam than anyone else, and Sierra going along with this is more so than benefiting the pair and benefiting Sam, which was a major criticism that I had with her at the beginning of the season, where it felt like Sierra was just kind of doing what Sam wanted. And the fact that we see her letting go of something that she had branched out to create on her own just to do what Sam wants is kind of knocking her back down to what I saw her as before this last episode here. So the fact that it's framed this way is not a great sign for Sierra's prospects moving forward. And while it's not too late for her to turn things around, where obviously now with the merge, she could explain why she voted out Anuka, where there's definitely plenty of reasons to explain why she voted out Anuka here. Not to mention there's still plenty of pathways for her in the future after the merge, with the likes of working with Tini and Caroline. There's definitely ways for Sierra to turn this around from a narrative perspective and also a gameplay perspective. But I felt the fact that the edit didn't really prop Sierra up for this, and if anything, just kind of showed her feeding into what Sam wants, is a big reason why I actually bumped her below Sam this week, and for that reason she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but number 3 we do have Sam. And I still have the same issues with Sam that I had before, where I still think there's a lot of potential for him to be overexposed. I think there's a lot of potential for him to eventually become this big threat that he's been billing himself as for a lot of the season. There's still a lot of potential for him to really feed into the perception that Sam and Sierra are this couple, and the fact that the other tribes pick up on that is a reason why they should be targeted. So I think there's a lot to worry about Sam moving forward, but I feel like the fact that he got his way in this episode by keeping Andy in the game, the fact that he's propped up in the narrative for doing so by keeping someone that he's clearly closer to than Sierra is, not to mention that he takes out Anuka, who was the biggest proponent of calling Sam a big threat during the pre-merge. How Anuka was the main person saying that she is glad that Sam found the idol and is glad that Sam's like taking all this heat as it'll make Sam a bigger threat later on. The fact that Sam wins that battle here and taking out Anuka is also a pretty good sign for Sam, narratively speaking. And I feel like at this point, him and Sierra are being propped up as a pretty major duo in the season that'll definitely shake things up in the post-merge. So I think there's a lot to like here with Sam at this point, and the fact that he gets his way in the actual vote over Sierra is a major reason why I bumped him back above Sierra for this week. But I still have enough reservations with how he's going to do moving forward and whether he'll be a true target or not to leave him behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have the same person I had at this spot last week, but we do have Andy. And I know I got a lot of flack last week for having Andy so high, and I also had Andy high the week before, and I still stand by it after this week. I still think Andy's clearly a contender at this point, where I felt like this was a pretty strong episode for Andy, all things considered, where we see him surviving the vote. We see him talking about the groundwork that he's laid and building this bond with Sam and Sierra, and that's what wins the day here, where we see him being targeted at the actual tribal, despite him losing the challenge, and despite him being this clear person to be taken out. And we even get a decent amount of content of him, like, working to survive the vote, where we see him narrating, like, this whole scheme to get Rachel and Anuka to relay this fake plan to him. And obviously a lot of that's pretty good. Now, admittedly, I don't think it's as exceptional as what I thought it was in the moment, as Jeff revealed on the On Fire podcast that they have been wanting to experiment with his editing style for a while, of showing this person, laying out step by step how they're going to get through the vote. And obviously the fact that they use this here probably doesn't mean that Andy's getting any special treatment by being propped up in this way. But I still think it's good in the sense that we see Andy paying the dividends of the storyline that he set up earlier, talking about how he is this serious strategist, someone who was able to build this connection with Sam and Sierra, and the fact that they have his back in this episode and that he gets his way over someone who was actively targeting him and Anuka. So I still think Andy is someone who's clearly being set up to be a big player in the season, someone who has definitely shown this growth arc of him going from being this nervous wreck to someone who has really stepped into the analytical side and the strategic side and the side that he wanted to embrace coming into the season. So I think Andy is still very much a contender for me, and I feel like this episode just provides more evidence for that. But I think the same question applies in the sense of whether this is just a journey edit, whether this is Andy like learning to get over his nerves and to really come back to seeing the side about him, or if it's just the Gabler storyline, someone who always knew what he was capable of and was just waiting to get his footing to really enact what he wanted to do. So I think that still question applies. I still think I'm going to have this debate for the foreseeable weeks, but I still think it leads to Andy being a clear contender and a big reason why he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 47 at this point is still Tini. Now, I still think there are questions to be had with Tini's edit, whether they're just getting a big player edit, whether they're just getting a journey edit as well, talking about how they had to learn to contend with their emotions after the Asia vote. And even in this episode, you can definitely qualm with them not getting more content than they probably should have, where obviously we see Rome continuing to not trust Tini here, and how Tini's clearly at the bottom and probably would have been voted out had they gone back to Tribal. That's not particularly great. I also think there was a missed opportunity during the social hour reward, where while they do get to explain being the only Lavo to go on that reward, and how they had to tell the Lavo tribe this fake story about what information they revealed there, they also didn't really get much input into the alliance that was set up between Caroline, them, and Rachel, where it's Caroline getting all the content there as opposed to Tini, so I think you can question that. And a part of me is still holding out for someone else to emerge at some point, where I do expect that within the next couple of episodes, we'll have a sense of where the season is truly going narratively, and through that, I would expect someone to really jump out at that point. And whether that's Tini or not is something we'll have to wait and see about. But I feel like for now, I think there's enough there with Tini to where they're clearly going to be this underdog that will eventually come out on top over the likes of Rome and Genevieve and the likes of them. Not to mention that I have enough question marks with other people at this current point to where I think Tini's a pretty safe pick to have a number 1 for this week. And while that could probably change after the Mergatory episode, I think for now it's enough to have them here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Hell's Kitchen and doing weekly recap streams with Flynn Masters and Ultranatic and Ruby, so you can look forward to those things as well. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.